Hi, welcome to AP Human Geography, and you are with our review sessions. I know some of you are so excited to be joining us. Just give me a second while I switch over my screen. And those of you that are waiting for my corny intro, it is coming. Just hold on. Just making sure we're at the right place with AP Human Geography. And those of you that don't know me, I am Kristen Brandt. I'm from Glenbard West High School in Glen Ellen, Illinois. And so the corny start this time is Bueller, Bueller, Bueller. So sometimes when we're teaching this, it feels like that. So even though this is live and my dog just ran behind me, I know you can't see her, and I've got my daughter sitting next to me who's going to help me with some stuff today. It still feels sometimes we're disconnected. And so Miss Lindsley tried this yesterday, and so I'm going to try it as well. And you'll see at the bottom of this screen, and it'll show up a few times throughout. We're going to try, and I think it's pronounced Slido, .com, and then that would be our meeting number, where you can ask us questions during the live presentation. So if you're watching this taped, unfortunately, we're not going to be monitoring during all hours of the night. We'll do our best to answer them in real time. The other thing I would say is hold on to the FRQ formatting questions. I'll do a little bit of that today, but trust that I believe it's May 1st and April 30th. Miss Lindsay's going to do 2 days of just FRQ prep, and she's got some great tips and tricks, and she's going to help you that I'm really excited for not only you guys, but my students as well. So you've got, I think I've stalled enough on this screen, but it will come up again later. And so today we are going to be taking a look at that culture unit. And so my guess is that your teachers are like me, and we can get bogged down in this unit because there's so much cool stuff to look at. So we're really going to just focus on big idea 2. And we want to look at the interaction of people and how that contributes to the spread of cultural practices. So we're really kind of looking for those interactions that we're going to be looking at today. So yesterday, Ms. Lindsley had you look at this FRQ, ended with, and hopefully you looked at it overnight for homework, or for those of you just tuning in, it's your first time looking at it. I will tell you, this is one I use with my students quite a bit too, because I think it pulls in so many great ideas. And so remember, when we talk about our FRQs for future tests, I think the next slide, that stimulus-based ones are probably the way that they're going to go. I have no inside information other than what you guys know, but it seems to make sense to us. And so here's a really great example. So letter A, compare the concepts centripetal force and centrifugal force. So in the past, we might say define those. Well, the reality is we're not going to have you define, because you can Google that. But to compare, so if I talk about centripetal and centrifugal, so if I know centripetal forces are forces that bind a country together, centrifugal forces are forces that separate a country. Okay, so really what I'm talking about here is I'd work those definitions in, but what I'd want to talk about when I compare them is how important are these when we're building a country, when we're trying to move forward, when we're trying to, so both of these then compare our forces that can help define our country moving forward. And then they can be things that are positive in nature or negative in nature. Explain a centripetal force that affects the viability of the states on the map. So when we explain, so the first thing you want to do is pick one of the states. So I'm going to pick, let's pick India. And so when I look at that, so the viability of that. So I'd probably talk about, maybe a centripetal force there is their religion. And so we know that the majority of people living in India are Hindu. And so I talk about how that can bring people together in celebrations and in our cultural landscape. It can unify us in our traditions. And so those types of things that really bring us together. And so when you explain, I'd even layer in a specific example as well. Then with reference to a specific example, then come up with explain a centrifugal force that affects the viability of the state shown on the map. And so I would also could use religion as well, but here's where I would talk about. So we know that not everybody is Hindu in India. And so that's where scale comes into play. And what we'll talk about is how those that are not part of that faith then feel excluded. And we could talk about the history of India and how that actually could tear them apart. Describe the changing cultural landscape as it experiences chain migration. This one I was thinking about how the toponyms changed in India. So for example, Mumbai, today it was Bombay when it was under British control, and so how that toponym changed. We could talk about how maybe some of the memorials change as well. The British influence, and then all of a sudden bringing in the new influence of kind of the Indian leadership as well. And then I want to pause on letter E. So explain how language can be a centrifugal force. So one of the examples could be from this region. So we could talk centrifugal. For crying out loud, there are 18 official languages in India, and that could divide a country. How do we communicate? How do we make decisions? On the other hand, what we could talk, it doesn't say it has to connect necessarily here. Couldn't you also talk about, how about in the United States, how we don't have an official language and how that can create some tension in the United States of different groups feeling that they don't have representation or voice. So I'm going to pause just for a second because my daughter's looking at questions coming in, and there were a couple that she wanted me to highlight. So we're going to talk more about test prep and what you can use on the test later on. So is ethnicity changeable? So they give opposite opinions, not giving a straight answer. So that is a good question when we talk about ethnicity and race. This is where it gets tricky. I would say, I talk to my students about it can evolve, but ethnicity, typically we talk about that you're born into it and that it's part of your heritage and part of defining who you are. That being said, I wouldn't say that the test questions are ever going to get that nitpicky. What they're going to ask you to do is, how does that define an area? And so that could be a centrifugal force here in America with our variety of ethnicities. Who do we align with? How do we define ourselves? And we define ourselves at different times and different places. And that really is probably more of that issue. Were there any more, Kennedy, that you think I should highlight? Okay, so would common language count as a centripetal force? I definitely would say yes, that common language would count as centripetal, because that idea of being able to communicate, that I would go into your lingua franca then and talking about business and talking about how that helps connect people as well. Okay, I think that's pretty. Okay, so the difference between race and ethnicity, I'll come back to that at the end, but what we are talking about, think about race is going to be more your physical attributes, ethnicity is going to be more, and so how they manifest themselves. And when we talk about ethnicity, we're going to talk more about your heritage and what you're born into. And so think about more how you're raised. I've probably just gone down a rabbit hole there as well. Nationalism definitely can be a part of a centripetal force as well. So we're going to move off of, just so you know, those test questions. We'll continue to move forward prepping for that, but there you saw with one stimulus, and then also another question where the first question will have two stimuli. And so make sure you're looking at the date, the images, and the titles as well. Okay. So you're doing a great job with the questions. My daughter's a little anxious, but she's doing great. Okay. So today what we're going to focus on diffusion. And so we're going to review our different types of diffusions, processes, but we also want to take a look at how they impact different things. And that's where we're going to talk. So those of you that were talking about language and religion, that's why I see you've got questions up there, but we're going to come back to that as we're looking through this idea of diffusion as well. So the first thing we have to do is, what are the different types of diffusion? And so while we might not ask you to define those on an AP exam, we could ask about examples or explain or describe. And so I think when we talk about relocation diffusion, remember we're talking about, this is the act of people physically moving to those areas. And so we talked 2 days ago in my session, we talked about migration. And this is always kind of fun when you talk about different waves of migration in the United States and different groups, what they bring with them. And I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. For those of you taking APUSH either next year or the year after, really that tension that developed between old immigrants and new immigrants. We're going to get to it at the end of this session, but when we talk about assimilation versus acculturation, the tension that those two groups had. Okay. The other thing, just taking a look at the waves, and really we look at that shift. So in the United States, the shift from European immigrants and then really shifting in looking at that the shift now coming from our southern border, looking at Central America, South America, coming to the United States. And this is where when we go back to that centrifugal or centripetal forces, this could be seen as something that strengthens us in our diversity, but could it also be something that kind of could tear us apart at times because not always accepting of others as well. Okay. This, I wanted to pause on. So those of you that are asking questions about the AP exam, I'll make sure I share those, but let's make sure we're focusing on this content because you've got to be able to connect those dots. And so the formatting of that test, I'll come back to that at the end. When you look at a map like this of the United States, these are some of the big themes that we see over and over again, and scale is one of those. And so, for example, I grew up in a little county up here called St. Croix County, and you'll see that it says it's green, mostly German descent, so our ancestry here. But here's what I will tell you. I would say, yeah, I'm part German, but I'm also, Scandinavian's pretty important too. I would say that I had some classmates that were other ethnicities as well. And what happens here is that we can't put every single person and their ancestry here on this map. And so you have to make some generalizations. Relocation, what did people bring with them? So up here, let me tell you about our lutefisk feeds that we have. If you've never had lutefisk, it is really one of the most disgusting fish in the world. And yet I eat it once a year because that's what my grandparents made. But there's other really good foods too. And so I think about the kringla or the lepsa that's from that group of people. Down here, if I look at the African American ancestry here, I could see it in the cultural landscape, Baptist churches. I could see probably some of the restaurants along here looking at our Mexican ancestry along our southern border. Our Native Americans, so our American Indian, if I take a look at our reservations, I can see that that's reflected in the culture. And so I might see it in places such, we talked about chain migration, so Little Italy. I could see it in the toponyms. I can see it in the housing styles as well. So Corona, somebody just asked if Corona could be an example of relocation diffusion. Actually, no, I'm going to hold on to that. So we would actually say, we're going to put that in contagious diffusion. And you're going to say, well, but didn't people have to bring it to there? So I want you, technically you're correct, but it's all about contact. And so if you think about relocation diffusion, that idea, it's going to take time, it's slow, and not everybody's going to absorb it. So for example, when I talked about the food that I was eating in those areas, not everybody ate those disgusting foods, such as lutefisk. That being, even though people saw it. Contagious diffusion, this is called expansion versus relocation. So expansion, it hits everything in its path. I mean, that's why we're home right now, is because we're trying to minimize the path that it's taking. And crazy, there's my map. So those of you that were asking questions, you're spot on. And that's really that idea. So when we think diseases, certain diseases, it's just everything in that path, and it's going to expand rapidly. Relocation doesn't expand rapidly. It tends to follow more your ancestry, tends to follow more your kind of, you can pick and choose a little bit more. You have some choice in that. Here with expansion, you really don't. Okay. Hierarchical, this is where it's going to, again, expansion, its intent is to spread, okay, but it's going to kind of pick and choose, and so for different reasons, and so it'll skip over certain areas. And so we tend to think a lot about pop culture. So sometimes it's access, and it's having finances, it's having means. We talk about, I grew up in rural Wisconsin. I live in Chicago now, but prior to the internet, there was this time in our lives, it would actually start in your bigger cities, and it took a longer time to get to those smaller cities, partly just because of access. Sometimes it's wealth. I talk to my students too about certain articles of clothing or trendy things that are going to start within a certain group of people. And not everybody can afford it at first, so it's going to kind of hop to other areas of power. And so really kind of think about popular culture. The problem with hierarchical a lot of times is that, and popular culture, is that it's fleeting. By the time these smaller areas have gotten the trend, typically then it is starting to die out other areas, or it takes money to keep up with these things. And so that makes it really difficult for people to kind of stay on point. Okay. We would probably talk about, somebody asked about what type of would religion be. And so we are going to talk about that as a universalizing religion, but we're also going to talk about it as more relocation. And so think about it, it's not going to hit everybody in its path. It's more about that relocation. It's about sharing those ideas and kind of inviting people into it. This one to me is always kind of my favorite when I talk about stimulus. And what we talk about here is that when it diffuses from the hearth and then it goes someplace else, and they adopt and make something new. So if I'm in Canada, maybe I'll get some poutine on the menu, or this past summer, McDonald's had their global menu. If I was I believe it's in Japan, they'll offer rice patties. So instead of the buns, you'll have your food in between the rice. They've got shrimp on the menu. So kind of in McDonald's. So kind of making it their own, and so reflecting the culture. So a lot of you were asking about religion and language. And so that's really where we're going to spend the crux of it, is because this is kind of really when we talk about shaping those interactions, and that's going to set us up for our next one, or later in the week when we start talking about conflict, that a lot of it comes back to this. And so those of you earlier on that were asking about centrifugal forces, yes, these can definitely be centripetal and pull us together, but we're going to see that they can also be centrifugal and pull us apart as well. So as always, I tell my students, you should know these hearths. When we talk about these areas, because at the end of the day, I feel like everything evolves out of these areas. And so how they spread or what spreads, so that's going to become a little bit more nuanced as we're moving forward. So when we talk about this idea of conquest, and that's actually going to lead us into the next one, somebody asked that question, like, what type is that? So we would say relocation. Because they're kind of taking over. And so there's not a lot of choice in that matter. I wouldn't split the hairs that much that I would say you do need to know that that is really how we start to see the spreading of language and religion. And so when we take a look at language here, and we look at our language hearth map, you should notice that the Indo-European language dominates so much of the globe. And that really goes to the question that somebody asked on the Slido, was really about where does conquest fit? And, I'll actually jump to this map and then I'll go back. I mean, this is where we find Indo-European language family dominant. Well, those are all areas that Great Britain at some point either conquered or had colonies or had ports or something. And so by that, they're going to bring their language. Religion is going to be introduced to that area. And so we can see English spoken in India. We can see English spoken in South America. We can see Christianity in some of these areas as well, because of that idea of bringing it with them. And so I mentioned Indo-European. And so there's a few languages that I tell my students that we need to know. I'll be honest, I spend a whopping 2 to 3 days on language. I don't spend a ton of time, because you could get so into the weeds with this. What really important? And I think you guys already made that connection. It's about that connection of sharing the beliefs and the culture and spreading it throughout the area. when I look at this map, so yes, Indo-European, I tell them Sino-Tibetan, and they're like, well, why, Mrs. Brandt? It's not very diffused very far. Well, one, when we look at religion next, that'll make sense, but two, hello, 1 billion people. So that is why I asked them to know that. We could break this down. Many of you are probably studying one of the Romance languages in school, and so learning to speak Spanish or French or Italian. We talk about, English comes from the Germanic language, so maybe some of you are learning to speak German as well, but that influence of he who conquers brings not only their language, but their religion as well. Toponyms. So yes, you could say language is part of relocation diffusion, yes. So toponyms, this I just thought was interesting. We've got 16 cities that are named Georgetown in the entire world. And this was just taken from a Google map here. But here's the deal. Who probably conquered? Who probably has some influence? I mean, look at the toponyms. You'll see some of that relocation. You'll see some of that movement of people and goods and ideas based off of their names, based off of the resources that they have there. Religion is another one. And so religion is interesting from the standpoint when we talk about hearths. Again, you're going to find Christianity spread throughout the world because of the dominance of Great Britain. Doesn't mean everybody accepts it, but it does mean that you typically are going to find that influence throughout the world. Is there a question, Kennedy? Do we have to memorize all the language branches? Heck no, please do not memorize all those language branches. That was a great question. Thank you if I was not clear on that. No, so I'll finish up with that real quick with the language and with the religion too. There's no way, look at this map, you're never going to remember all of them. So find something that you're really interested in or passionate about, or it's most dominant. So I would say either the Indo-European so that you understand its influence and its diffusion process, and call it good, because you could apply that to anything. Here we go with religion. We're going to highlight 3 or 4, but there's no way you're going to be able to memorize all the ins and outs. It's those connections and those interactions that are more important. So when we take a look at this, I think that we talk about majority of religion by country. This, I think, definitely, look at the red here. Well, is there a lot of similarities between the red on this map, Christianity, and the map that I had up about Indo-European or British influence throughout the world? Absolutely. So what we really want to talk about, though, is this idea of universalizing religions. And I know your teachers talked about this. And right now you should be looking at this map and say, Mrs. Brandt, one of those is not a universalizing religion on your chart here. So when I was looking for these maps, you keep finding this idea of those hearths and how do they diffuse and how do they spread. So remember, universalizing is their intent is to spread their faith. It is to not only just move, but it also is, and so somebody asked earlier on if it could be considered hierarchical. Absolutely, because you're not going to be able to pull everybody in to that faith, but that is a major goal of universalizing religions. And so you'll see I covered up Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are considered universalizing religions. The goal is to invite others in, to share, to really grow their faith. Okay. We also take a look at where they diffused out of. And so we take a look at that location. I always think do think it's important for us to take a look at trade routes. Somebody talked about conquest, and so we talk about diaspora, and we talk about Romans coming in and pushing out Jews. We could talk about that movement and that idea of how important Jerusalem is to both Christianity, Islam, and Islam, and I'm going to leave off the other one for just a second. But what is interesting when we look at this, Christianity and Islam, we're going to see definitely diffused throughout the world. Buddhism, well, we're going to see smatterings here or there. For the most part, though, it tends to stay in East Asia. And so part of that is because of trade routes. Part of it is because of when movements started really occurring out of China, other religions had already been introduced to those areas. And so I think this is important when we start looking at numbers. So Christians are still the largest group. If we take a look at numbers of Christians versus Muslims, for all you out there, my students do this all the time. My students try to tell me that Catholics are their own group. Remember, Catholics are part of Christianity. And so, but what we are seeing is kind of this growth in secularism or in indifference, partly because of how globalization has kind of taken over as well. Sorry. So how did Britain diffuse Christianity? Didn't Christianity? Correct, but where did so the question is, I'm confused. How did Britain diffuse Christianity? So remember, Britain is Christian. So it's not that they're bringing and saying that our mission is to Christianize everybody. They're putting their ports, they're putting their resources there, and those people are bringing their ideas with them. Missionaries will follow behind that. Now, in the United States, we have a history of trying to Christianize the world. The Spanish-American War, we tried to Christianize areas, by the way, that were already Christian. And so that is just part of that story. So it opens up a pathway, it opens up a door. So it's not necessarily like that was their mission, other than it was part of the goal, God, and glory. And so they were bringing those ideas with them. And so you take a look, it might be different types of Christianity, but take a look at Christianity around the world here on this map. Versus here, take a look at where we find primarily Islam. You're going to find most of that, you know, like the numbers in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and Asia Pacific. And that goes back to the student's question, is that the trade routes are going to be different. So if I'm here, Great Britain and Europe had trade routes all over the globe. Here, most of the trade routes came out and would go through Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia has one of the largest concentration of Muslims today. And it's because of those trade routes. And so, yes, we have a growing number in North America, but it's primarily, I mean, we've talked about this, it takes money to move, it takes money to do these things. And so people are going to follow them, those trade routes, but primarily they end up staying in those regions just based off of resources. Buddhism, though, take a look at this map, just how concentrated it stayed in East Asia. And so, yes, there are representatives of Buddhism, Buddhists all over the globe, but the numbers really, even though it's a universalizing religion, really pretty much stayed isolated. Part is if I keep talking about trade routes, or if I go using your words, the word conquest, that was not the objective of China. And so it's not the objective of Buddhism either. And so, yes, it is about bringing people in. It is about bringing, they do want to spread their faith, but those pathways of getting people to those areas, they were just a little later to the game to do those things. Do you need to know the origin of each language? No. And religion and where they diffuse to? I mean, I don't know what question they're going to ask. And so I think you should understand, I think the four basic, your four core religions. I think Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and then when we get to the ethnic religions, I should say two more I would add in, Hinduism and Judaism, because at the end of the day, those are kind of, in AP Human Geo, it is about that hearth to diffusion to cultural landscape, that impact. That's that whole point, that movement, and then how do we know? And that can either bind us together or pull us apart. And so here with universalizing location or religion, sorry, we can see it in the cultural landscape. And so you could, I wouldn't do all of them, but I would take a minute if you wanted to talk about places of worship. Again, nobody's going to ask you to identify what type of place of worship it is, but how does that reflect that faith? And so what we saw within Christianity is typically we would see it in the center of towns, used for also business. For a lot of times the bell, it was the meeting center. The bell was a way to communicate with the communities. We could talk about, I love talking about the Hajj with my students, because if you want to talk about movement of people, think about the yearly movement of people to Mecca and just how orderly and peaceful that is. We could also talk about, this is Dearborn, Michigan. the fastest and largest growing mosque in the United States. We talked about that, I forget which day, a couple days ago, but that idea, again, on the landscape, we can see a mosque. Drive down your neighbor, in your neighborhood, see if you see things changing, or if you see different religions moving into an area. It'll tell you about the culture of people as well in that community. And then if we take a look at Buddhism, and so we take a look at the temples or the stupas, but also you can see in the background here, Buddha just kind of becomes a symbol beyond even the Buddhist faith, but that idea of peace and tranquility, and how that's almost transcended beyond its religion and into kind of mainstream culture when we talk about Buddhas, or we talk about even yoga practices, that idea of meditation, how it's transcended beyond its faith. So if Buddhism doesn't spread through conquest or trade routes, then what are some of the major ways that it does spread? And so it's going to spread more traditional relocation as far as part of, I'm going to call them, for lack of a better term, mission trips, like part of, we're going to send the monks someplace to share and to spread. It's why it hasn't taken off around the world, just because the numbers just are not there. So remember then, ethnic religion you're born into, you can, it's a very extensive process, choose to convert, but for practical purposes here, we're going to just focus on that this is, you're born into this, that this is, the goal is not to grow the faith other than through their own children. And so we take a look at Judaism, and when we look at it, you're going to say, well, it seems like it's pretty distributed throughout the world. Okay, so it's not the intent. Like, that is because of forced migration. If we think of the original diaspora, where the Romans came in and kicked the Jews out, if we think of, and so pushed them into Europe, Zionism, the pull of Jews back to the homeland. But how about even World War II? So they had settled in Europe, and then Jews were a targeted population, and so if they could move and get away, they attempted to. And at some point, then other places became safe houses at the end of World War II. And so the dispersion of Jews is not typically by choice, it's been by force. Historically, today, obviously, by choice. But the goal, again, is not to grow the faith. It's going to be truly based on relocation, and just those numbers are there because of people choosing to move to those areas today. Okay. Hinduism, also ethnic, and this one primarily you're going to see small numbers throughout. The goal, again, is not to spread. A lot of this has to do with the conflicting ideas of I would say, if you think of your three monotheistic religions too, that this one is going to really conflict with those and the idea of one God. And so this is going to stay much more concentrated in their region. Cultural landscape, if we take a look at the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, so that remaining, that tradition of kind of remembering all those that have passed, your sins, and just kind of all the atrocities that have happened to Jews over their lifetime. This one I like to talk about with my students within the Hindu faith. So you have the pilgrimage to the Ganges River. And so that idea of Mother Ganges, and that idea of hopefully reaching nirvana. But the other thing, you're not going to find funeral homes or cemeteries. You're going to find cremation services, because that idea of releasing the spirit. And so that cultural landscape, so you're going to find people at the river, you're going to find cremation services, that idea of burning, because trying to release the soul, and some of those services that go with that. And so it's going to be different, if you travel through India versus traveling through, I would even argue, Pakistan, because Pakistan is a Muslim country. You're going to find more traditional burial opportunities versus in India. And so last but not least, some of those effects. And we've talked a little bit about the effects because we talked about the cultural landscape. We've talked about kind of that diffusion, but there's a few things that we also know that they can not only just change, but that idea that they can disappear over time. And so there's a couple things that I want to point out. And so, for example, with languages, languages can become endangered. And really, this is a map looking at where they're critically endangered or just endangered. And so this one, I think, are these hotspots. This one kind of narrows. It's a little cleaner to look at. But what's interesting about this is that as popular culture spreads, as people continue to connect with one another, languages start to be lost. And think about some of your friends that maybe where their families speak another language at home. Do your friends speak another language around you? Do they speak their native language with their parents? Some of my students don't anymore. So what happens when they have kids? How will their kids learn that language? And so we're not talking about kind of these common, and when I say common, we're not talking about Spanish at this point, but we are taking a look at maybe some indigenous languages that as those numbers of those groups get smaller and smaller, there's not enough people to carry that on. If we take a look at the big question here, that innovations change or disappear over time, I think where we look at, that's a fear within language, but what it really means is if we lose our language, are we losing part of our identity? And that's really where it starts to come into this idea of assimilation and acculturation. So we think about history of the United States and that idea of those new immigrants that I mentioned at the top of our 40 minutes here. And that idea of assimilating and becoming one, that melting pot mentality. And so if you want to go back to the questions that Miss Lindsley left for you, that would be a centripetal, kind of that binding. But then if you weren't part of that, were you kind of left out? And so we talk about acculturation. So kind of taking parts of another culture, making some modifications, more of that salad bowl mentality that is going to develop. We saw that more with the new immigrants, that today we see that as a strength. I would say at the turn of the century, it caused a lot of conflict. But then we even create, this idea of syncretism, the blending of cultures and ideas from different places. So I was pulling up some Tex-Mex ideas, because this is one of our great examples. And so taking some, the Mexican culture and food and taking Texans and kind of blending something together. And so kind of that blending of something new. We've seen this with religion as well, but I think Tex-Mex is probably that best example. One of the questions, do you think eventually in the end, we will all be one homogeneous group as far as ethnicity and language? It's a great question. Wow, loaded, right? I would probably argue, well, if you were in my class, I would say, what do you think? But you asked me, so I will give you my response. Definitely not in your lifetime. And I think sometimes we've seen this as well. The more globalized we become and the more pressure we put on stuff, we might lose some of the smaller ones. But what we're finding is people are kind of holding on and craving that local diversity again. People are craving that ownership. My guess is a lot of you, why am I, Lawrence in Kansas, there's a little Sweden in that area because they're trying to kind of reinvigorate their culture. Think about the little Italy that I showed you earlier, or Chinatown. That idea of how do we also kind of bond together when the whole world around us is spinning out of control, or it's forcing us to want to believe one thing. Maybe we are going to actually kind of say, this is what we're not going to negotiate on. So I don't think so, but I do think, I think that that's a really good question that gives you pause to think. Okay. A lot of questions. So I think some of you are answering one another. And so that idea, that's great. My daughter said, yes, you're helping one another. So the countries with the most spoken languages, if we're kind of summing this up, and so do languages separate us? Do they define us? Do they bring us together? I think that this is something it's worth considering. Just take a look at, if Papua New Guinea, I paused because my superintendent actually grew up, he was on a missionary in that region, but talking about all the different indigenous people and the languages that they speak, and that's really how they define themselves. In the United States, look at all the different languages spoken here, even in China and Mexico. And so I think what's really important is when we talk about these different languages is that remember, there is an opportunity for how did they get there, but also that it is that opportunity for us to define ourselves. And it's the same way with religion as well. So don't necessarily always think about it as in that the strict adherence. What we're talking about is, where do you see it in the culture? Where do you see it in the landscape? How do you see it in their, I mean, even in the United States, I mean, look at your dollar bill, look at the Pledge of Allegiance. I mean, the reality is that there is a huge Christian influence in even the development of the United States. And so for better or for worse, that plays a role in how we develop. So questions that I would like you to think. Kennedy's looking through for a few more. And I think what I would tell you this as you're looking over the questions that I have for you to consider for tomorrow, because I will be leading this, so I'll walk you through these questions tomorrow. Things that I would want you to think about is some of these things in human geo, there's not always a right or wrong, that you can argue both ways. If you have examples, or many different ways, if you have examples and you have explanation and you have, that's the beauty of this. And I think that that's really something to celebrate about this course. And so a couple of things that I'd want you to think about. This was taken from AP Classroom. And so identifying two specific means by which new expressions in popular culture are diffused globally. So think about how popular culture could be diffused. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Popular culture often spreads through a combination of different types of diffusion. And I think you guys talked about that on the Slido today. And so you talked about, well, how do I separate some of these things? And you can't always. And so you're right. Think about COVID, where yes, it started with relocation, but then the contagion is that anyone you come in contact with. And so think about how that might influence. And then when a new word diffuses, they confront barriers, or when these new words diffuse, they do confront barriers. Identify and explain two barriers to diffusion that are often encountered when new terms become popular. So we didn't talk about that. I'm asking you to think about it, and then we'll take a look at it next week, or tomorrow, sorry. Kennedy, any other? So she's highlighting, oh yeah, we didn't talk about ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism, that's that idea of favoritism towards your culture and judging everyone based off of your culture. You know, the example I use with my students, we looked at, why am I blanking? The pygmies. And we talked about how they were eating termites. And we talked about, and we call them the baka. And my students are always, ew, gross. I'm like, but termites are actually a source of protein. You're right. For us, that's not something we typically eat, but you have to understand. So that's ethnocentric. I'm judging it off of what I eat versus understanding why that protein and without even giving it a try. So this was a great question too. Does the variety of languages in Indonesia have anything to do with how many islands are there? I would argue yes, but not only reason. Indonesia is a major trade route. We talk about choke points, because there's so much trade that travels through there. So you've got a lot of exposure to other languages, but yes, all those isolated islands are going to develop independently of one another originally. And so they're definitely going to reflect in those languages. Okay, so as always, if people are having trouble with technology, feel free to help somebody out, to let them know this how to contact College Board. And tomorrow we are going to we'll finish up. We're going to review that FRQ, and then we're going to dive into probably my favorite. We're going to look at some agriculture. But out of all seriousness, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for the questions. I apologize. This was my first day, so if it seemed a little distracting, I apologize. But I think Kennedy did a great job kind of trying to pull stuff out. And thank you for answering one another. Remember, it comes down to examples. It comes down to being able to explain yourself. We want to find ways to reward the work that you're doing. You're working so hard, and we're so proud of you. So hang in there, and I hope you can join us tomorrow. Thanks.